One thing I want to talk about really quickly is building an anti-war movement. So this is something that I have noticed when I look back in history and I look at the Vietnam War protests, thousands of people out in the streets. And I know there were two things that were different back then. There was the draft, so it affected more people. And then two, mainstream media actually showed civilian casualties in Vietnam on television, which I never saw in my lifetime with any of the wars that happened since I've been alive. So I think the American people have been shielded, so to speak, to see how many people are actually dying in these wars that are not fighting in these wars, including children. And then also, we don't have the draft. So when I was growing up, there were more people that were in the military. My dad was in the military. There was a whole community of military people. Now, I don't know anybody in the military. It's kind of hard to find someone that is attached to it, so to speak. But what I have noticed is that even trying to mobilize people just to come to anti-war rallies, which I'm going to show one of them in just a second, it's very difficult and very hard. I think a lot of Americans have been propagandized. They just believe what they hear on mainstream media in reference at least to this war between Russia and Ukraine. They're not even knowledgeable about some of the attacks that have happened in Syria. They're not aware of the drone strikes that have happened in Somalia. When I talk to them about Yemen, they don't even know these things are happening. It's like, it's not even being covered on mainstream media. And so that's a big part of the problem. But how do you think we mobilize people to start an anti-war movement again in this country?
Well, you know, it's funny what you said about the draft. I know some people on the left who say we should have a draft again, because as you point out, that would, you know, everybody would have skin in the game. Everybody would be concerned. I don't think it would quite work that way. That's my first argument against it. But the other thing they've done since Iraq, I mean, there were huge, I mean, and now it's about to be the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That brought people out in the street. But if you take out the equation of Americans dying, fewer people care. So ever since Iraq, they have had proxy wars. They have used sanctions. They use old-fashioned coups and interfering. Look at what they did in Ukraine. They got Ukrainian fascists to take over the government there. They've gotten jihadists and to destroy Libya, tried to do the same thing to Syria, use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. Now they're trying to use Taiwan as a proxy against China. So they know that the thing that people hate the most is the idea of Americans dying in some foreign land. So they make sure that doesn't happen anymore. And as you point out with the corporate media, you know, there was a time when occasionally they would tell you something the state didn't want you to know. And you're right about Vietnam. You know, they talked about Walter Cronkite and how people trusted him so much. And if he questioned Vietnam, then, you know, that was a big problem for them. That doesn't happen now. You know, the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg's expose, that would not happen now. The New York Times and the Washington Post, they're not exposing anything the Biden administration doesn't want you to know. And their reporting on Ukraine is horrible. I mean, it's horrible. They have the week before the first anniversary, New York Times editorial board. I mean, it was just Putin's evil. That's all you need to know. Russia's lying about everything. NATO only expanded because everybody was scared of Russia. And that's it. That's all. There's nothing else for you to know. I mean, it was dreadful. And that's the kind of so-called reporting that we get in corporate media. So people don't know enough. You really have to be interested. And it's a very dangerous thing, I think, that you have to be predisposed to want this information, to seek it out. And if you don't, then you're, you know, maybe, excuse me, I believe that most people probably don't want $100 billion to go to Ukraine. I think that's something you would not have to convince people of. It's something that, of course, because we have no representation in Congress, it's not anything anybody acts on. But I think most people say, what why don't we have things in this country? Why didn't we get that extra $600? What about the student loan debt? All the things that we've talked about. If the average person had their way, Ukraine would not be getting any more money. I'm convinced of that.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, there's very limited understanding of what these wars mean, what they do to the whole, the suffering they cause in the rest of the world. Or even with the military, that we have this poverty draft. I mean, and you're right. There was a time when most men had been in the military, but that's a long time ago now. And it's something that doesn't touch people's lives. And now they've made sure that even that small group of people in the military are stateside, or maybe they're in a base in a foreign country, but they're not in danger on a battlefield somewhere. So we're, we are up against it. But when there are these protests, we have to talk about them and promote them as much as we can, because there are people who they may appear to be uninterested, but if someone says to them, here's an opportunity to register your opposition, they will participate. Of course, that's why they don't give you that information, because they know that's true. So as difficult as it may be, I'm a member of Black Alliance for Peace, and I'm a member of the United National Anti-War Coalition. I believe very, very strongly in organizing. You have to join an organization, and we are building, and we are getting people out there. And we have to talk about how to strategize to make these manifestations count, to move the needle, so to speak. But I think it's very, very important, and I support all of these efforts to register our opposition to what the U.S. does around the world.
And in reference to organizing, especially with something that's for anti-war, do you feel there should be red lines? And I ask because there was a rally recently, Rage Against the War Machine in DC. I was at the rally. I felt like Rachel Maddow's reporting of the rally was very off, way off. Of course, it's Rachel Maddow. Yeah. I do know that there were, some people who didn't feel comfortable going to that rally. I actually, I went to the rally. I had no problems. But do you feel there should be red lines? Because some people felt like they shouldn't go to a rally if there's going to be a speaker there that may be libertarian, or a speaker there that may be conservative, or a speaker that may have said concerning things about different communities, like LGBTQ communities and things like that. Where do you feel people should draw that line?
Well, to your point, people drew lines all over the place. I did not participate. Organizations I just mentioned didn't participate, but we weren't asked to as well. I think, but there were people I respect who did participate, and I still respect them. I'm not planning to fall out with anybody because they went to or spoke at Rage Against the War Machine. But I think what this points out is we have to build the movement. And the fact that there could be a credible march with, for example, libertarians. So yes, they are opposed to a lot of military spending. Yes, they are. But they're also opposed to government spending in general. So a lot of the things we've talked about, they're not in favor of. So I think we have to ask ourselves after this event is over, are these people you can work with? Are these organizations you can work with? Do you have the same ideology? And you have to ask yourselves, well, how do libertarians move the needle in the anti-war movement? And I think some of the arguments were, I think, not accurate. So, for example, we were told, well, if you want to reach working class white people, you have to have conservatives involved. Well, first of all, who says working class white people are all right wing? I don't think that's true. So I think that you have to stop and examine some of the suppositions being made that allowed this to to move forward. I remember when I first heard about it, I just hadn't heard there were some individuals speaking. Am I frozen? I think
You're
I
moving
froze.
again.
Okay, cool. There were some individuals speak. I just had not heard of these organizations. I hadn't heard of some of the people, which does not mean it's something not to join with. But I think I fall more on the side of having those lines and making sure that we build the left, that we build the anti-war left, that we build anti-imperialism. I think that should be our emphasis, rather than getting sidetracked by who's at this rally, who's at that rally. Can we be with those people? I have to say that, if you're going to, if not change your own politics, but coalesce with people who have very different politics, it's got to be for a better reason than a specious argument about working class people being libertarians. I'm not even sure that that's the case. But I think one of the problems, it was clear to me that the organizers did not know how to organize. I mean, I think they made some mistakes that were caused by the fact that they don't have these relationships. Like they invited individuals, some individuals who they knew might draw a bigger crowd, but they did not reach out to some of the groups I've mentioned and others. So that you can have a real movement that's actually going to accomplish something. So having said all of those things, I believe we've got to work with people who are on board with ending these wars, stop stealing our money to go overseas, to use it for human needs here. So that's why, for me, I can't, if someone says, oh, I'm against $100 billion going to Ukraine, but I also think we don't need Medicare for all, that for me is not going to work. I'm not going to hate that person or hate anybody who did participate. But I think the lesson to take from all of this is to build amongst ourselves. We've got to build. And then I believe we'll be less likely to have these fights that are not productive, that don't go anywhere, because I don't know how many people were reached. I mean, and how do you determine a successful protest? Is it the number of people? That can be part of it. But did you get people who weren't involved before? Do you have a strategy for how to approach elected officials? Do you have a strategy for dealing with the media? Do you have a strategy for educating people? I mean, these are very big questions, and I'm not saying people have to have all of them answered in order to take any action, but I want us to be focused on a bigger picture. And I think if we do that, we will go a long way towards building the movement against these wars.
I think for me, some of the things that I've seen been in organizing spaces, I've seen this with every event. I think this is the thing, like when we did the marches for Medicare for All, that event was heavily smeared. Some people didn't like that some of the speakers were conservative. There was a conservative speaker who was a doctor who agreed with Medicare for All, didn't agree with other issues that we push for on the left, but he said Medicare for All is a no-brainer and we should have it in this country. So that's an event that was heavily smeared. I've seen the Julian Assange event was also smeared. And it's just like, it seems like to me, sometimes it kind of comes across as, and I totally understand if someone tells me like, that's not for me, I don't feel comfortable coming to that, that's their right and their decision. But I think it becomes a little bit strange when I see people online trying to smear an event and tell people, don't go, don't go, don't go. Then it just kind of seems like, okay, what's your angle here? And I saw that with like multiple events that I've been a part of. I think when I look at like an anti-war movement and I'm looking at getting numbers out and people out in the streets, the 50,000 people that show up in Denmark and that show up in Germany, they're not all on the left, but they're all against this war. and they're all upset with NATO. So I think that's something we have to ask. Like, even if we look back at the Vietnam protests that happened back then, was every protester like out on the streets? Were they all like on the left? I don't think so. So I think I get where you're coming from. For me, I kind of, when I'm looking at organizing, I organize with people around the issues. And then I know there's certain people that I can work with on certain issues. So like the George Floyd protest, for example, I know what groups to go to for that. I knew where to go. Even some of those people didn't agree with me on Medicare for all. They were not for that at all. In fact, a lot of them were liberals. They were just like, we do not want government-run healthcare. When I looked at the Julian Assange event, I organized with people that are passionate about against censorship and for free press. So I know where to go with. And I think that's the thing for me, is that I've never been able to find one particular group that agrees with me on every single issue when it comes to organizing.
I think, one of the problems that I think you're pointing out, there's a lot of people who are just unserious to spend time online worrying about what somebody else chose to do, or making up a specious argument. That's not where I put my efforts. I'll put it that way. The problem with somebody like Julian Assange is the propaganda has worked. I mean, it's terrible what the lies they told about him. It's like, oh, Trump won because of Julian Assange. Not that Trump got $4 billion, the equivalent of $4 billion in free advertising from corporate media. But it's Julian Assange, and he, the Russians gave him something. And in fact, somebody leaked something to him. It's a longer story. But that lack of information, that plays a role when we try to move, that people will bring in all kinds of irrelevancies. But, I would say in general, you have to, I believe it's important to have an ideology behind what we do. So if someone is I don't know who this person was who spoke at the Medicare for All rally.
Dr. Joseph Jarvis.
Okay, I don't know the name, sorry. But if the point should be that this is a public good. Healthcare is a public good. It should be a right. So it seems to me that if you're asserting that healthcare should be a right, it should be in public hands, as it is all over the world. And it should not be in private hands. It should be not just Medicare for all, but it should be run by us. And I think when you say something, as an example, when you say that, but you have to reach that point. It's not just about how much a particular person spends on their health care. And that is a heavier lift to get people to think beyond that, because we're trained in this country, we're, encouraged to believe in irrelevancies and in a lot of foolishness. So it can be difficult. I'm not saying that it isn't, but I think when you have that ideology that you hold on to, I think you're less likely to get tripped up by this. So I'm not just personally, I'm not just against the proxy war in Ukraine. If it were up to me, the defense budget would be cut in half. The U.S. would not be interfering in the affairs of other nations. That money that would be cut from the defense budget would be used for us, because we would have healthcare as a right. We would have housing as a right. We wouldn't have homeless encampments everywhere. And when you organize around those principles, and when you have those strong principles, I think it's a lot less likely that you'll be tripped up by some of the things that happened, especially with that particular event. And it can be okay that everybody's not at the same thing. I don't think we should be afraid of that. It's like, listen, if libertarians want to campaign against the military budget that we have at it, go for it. But then, of course, when we talk about what that money should be used for, and that is the problem, that is the elephant in the room that can't be ignored, because on some issues, they are, we're going to be opposed to each other.
You should talk to Larry Sharpe about this, Margaret. Have you spoken to him before?
No.
Larry Sharpe, he's in New York with you. He was trying to run as governor of New York as a libertarian. He was about to get on the ballot, then they prevented him from being on the ballot. It's the whole thing that went into that. But Larry Sharpe, he brought us on from RBN, and that was a wild time. But but we agree with him on some issues, and then other issues we were like, no, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, the New York State legislature kicked the Libertarians. They lost their ballot line the same way the Greens did. Basically, they lifted the threshold a lot to just get signatures, to get a certain percentage of the vote in order to have a ballot line. And for the first time in my lifetime, only Democrats and Republicans are on the ballot in New York State. They have the Working Families Party, though, as Democrats. I don't consider them a different party, but they, we used the Greens had a ballot line, Libertarians had a ballot line. There were a couple other small parties, but the oligarchy in New York State did us all in.